Hello, everyone. Welcome to Humanist Canada's monthly webinar series. I'm Anna Popovich, Program Director at Humanist Canada, and I'm pleased to welcome our guest today, Dr. Stephanie Coontz, for a conversation and Q&A with you about a topic that concerns us all, the problematic past and uncertain future of marriage. There is no formal presentation today, so please feel free to ask a question or comment anytime. You can do so by raising your hand at the bottom of the screen, and I'll ask you to unmute yourself, or you can submit your question with the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. And just a heads up that this webinar, as always, will be recorded. Stephanie is the Director of Research and Public Education at the Council on Contemporary Families. She is also Professor Emerita at the Evergreen State College in the US and the former Woodrow Wilson Fellow. She has authored 7 books on marriage and family life, including The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap in Marriage, and The Nostalgia Trap and Marriage, a History, which was cited in the Supreme Court decision on marriage equality. She also edited American Families, a Multicultural Reader, and a new book of essays, For Better and Worse, The Problematic Past and Uncertain Future of Marriage, will be published in 2024. Her many articles for the New York Times, CNN, and other outlets can be found on her website at stephaniecoontz.com. Welcome, Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining us. And we appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
So maybe we can begin this conversation with the following question. Why did you become interested in the subject of marriage, and what prompted you to explore the history of marriage across centuries?
Well, that's kind of a longer story. I'll try to keep it short. When I was, I loved history, and I majored in history in college, but I was also active in the civil rights movement and later in the women's movement. And I began to see how many people were left out of history. So first I went to trying to organize myself to learn more about working class history, African-American history, Native American, and women's history as that issue moved to the fore. And when I was finally hired at Evergreen State College after some time working for the peace movement, I was asked to write a book on the history of women. Well, this was back in 1975. And in those days, there were a lot of books being written, and most of them were either what's been done to women through the ages or what some women have managed to do despite it. So I said, well, I want to find a way to bring women and men into interaction. And where's that? Back in 1975, there weren't many places they were in equal numbers until I went, the family. So I actually started studying the family. And I first, a popular book, which was written after I had tried to do this more ponderous books on the history of the family, was The Way We Never Were. As that became more well-known, I started getting questions from reporters about marriage. And this is the way I think many academics and people who research write books. You get asked questions you can't answer. So you decide to write a book about it. So I really wasn't sure what to say about marriage when these reporters would ask me. And, when this was a time when I was on a lot of TV shows and, talk shows, like you don't want Oprah saying, what's marriage? And you going, da, 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 da. So I decided to research marriage. And that's where I've come.
Okay, so I obviously haven't gotten a chance to read your latest book. Looking forward to that when it comes out. So the book I've been working with for this interview is your 2005 book, Marriage, a History, with the subtitle of From Obedience to Intimacy, or How Love Conquered Marriage, which indeed reads like a story of a battle for intimacy, where for over 20 centuries, marriage has been a difficult proposition. And so specifically, you point out that the modern idea of marriage, one that encompasses a package of expectations, as you describe it, such as intimate friendship, love, and sex, is actually unusual in the history of humankind. So can you tell us more about this? A bit about the history?
Of
If
the
we
history
can
of
go back in
marriage.
time. Yeah, if we can go back in time.
Well, I think the main takeaway point from this is people are always talking about the traditional marriage, and there's no such thing. The traditional breadwinner marriage was probably the least traditional marriage form in all of history. And there's tremendous variety in what people expected of marriage, what form it took, how it was organized. But I've come to think that there were three main different systems of marriage. One, which the one we lived in for the most number of years, for thousands of years, out of their Paleolithic band level ancestors. And so I'll go back to it in a minute, but just then the one that moved out of that was the kind of marriages that arose as you began to get the development of class society and class inequalities and private property that needed to be passed down, and where the family, the household, was the central economic and political institution. So that you didn't go to banks to get loans, you figured out a marriage arrangement to get loans. So we can come back to that. But the third one was the one that we think of as traditional now, the male breadwinner family that arose started in the late 17th, began to really get together in the 18th century, and is the one that is now being overturned by a fourth marriage arrangement that is just emerging, and we're just beginning to figure out how that one works. But let me go back to the first one, and I won't try to give the lectures of all of them. Let me just do the first one, and then we can go any direction you want. But the first one is interesting because there's all these ideas about what was marriage invented for. Feminists say it was invented to oppress women, and men say sexist men at least say, well, it was invented to protect women and children. No, it looks like the earliest marriages were invented to get in-laws, which is kind of the opposite of what we think of marriage today. But when you look back at our band level ancestors trying to survive, trying to figure out how you can share and circulate food and people, because that is the key to survival when you're living off the land, marriage became a way of making alliances, of circulating people and resources as widely as possible. Marriage established a set of obligations bigger than we think of now. I mean, we think of, okay, your brother-in-law and your sister-in-law, but in many band level societies, your in-laws include the brother-in-law's brother's wife's sister, and you have these obligations. So marriage for thousands of years was a way of circulating resources. The practice was exogamous marriage. You marry out so that you gain new allies and friends and relatives in other bands. And there were no idyllic periods ever in human history, but we don't see any real evidence at all of systematic oppression of women there. Sharing was the most important way you survived in societies like that, where there was no ability to hoard or defend things. So marriage was a way of reaching out and extending your social networks. And that is what happened for thousands and thousands of years. That began to change, though, when you began to get the development of class society and inequality. And that's when you begin to get the more systematic oppression of women, of youth, of children. Marriages in the band level societies are often arranged because elders say, well, we think this would work, and we need connections with these. But in those band level societies, people were also free to refuse or to try it out and leave afterwards. In this later one that we can talk about, marriage becomes a very ruthless way of figuring out who gets to marry who and who is not allowed to marry who, and enforcing that tremendously.
Thank you. So if we again go back in time and maybe look at a couple of, for example, you have a chapter on.
I just lost
Sorry.
you. I
Yes,
just lost
it
your
looks
sound.
like there's a lag. Can you hear me now? It looks like
Yes.
there's yeah. So I'll repeat the question. So maybe we can, if you can tell us a bit more about specific cases. You have a chapter in your book on, for example, ancient Greece and Rome, which was quite fascinated. And you explain that in those societies, marriage, as you just said, did not rank high in the hierarchy of meaningful relationships. And we know that for Greeks, for example, being in love was a kind of sickness or a type of insanity. And
Well,
you have
unless it was
this,
with a younger man.
right, and you have this wonderful quote from Seneca, nothing is more impure than to love one's wife as if she were a mistress. So can you maybe expand a bit more about the practice of marriage
Mhm.
in
Well,
ancient
let me take it back a
Greece
little
and Rome?
bit
Yeah.
before Greece and Rome, because those weren't the first big class societies. What we find is that wherever you begin to get real class and economic differences and private property in societies, there is a sense that, first of all, you, like if I'm the mom of and I'm in the upper section of a society, a chieftain or an emerging state, I don't want my kids to just marry anyone. I do want them to marry someone to get an in-law with, but nowadays it's not to get just any old in-law to cooperate with. I wanted to marry somebody who's at least as wealthy and prosperous and high status as mine, and preferably more. So this is where you get tremendous controls being placed over who can marry whom, love being considered really kind of a distraction from marriage. If to the extent marriage is about love, the idea is that love should develop after marriage. You don't go do something so stupid as to marry your most important ally, your family's, bank account, their fellow workers in the family estate, just because you have this kind of sense that you love them. So you get a lot more control over children's choices, and there's a lot more control over men's as well, but particularly women's because of their fertility. Another thing that comes with the development of class society is the development of the institution of illegitimacy. Marriage becomes a way of saying, okay, it's the way that I want my family property to be passed down. And so if my child marries someone who or has an affair with someone who I don't even know, I don't want them to have a claim on the child. And this is where you get the tremendous emphasis on illegitimacy. So with all of these class societies, Greece, Rome, ancient Egypt, increasingly, and then of course, right up into the feudal period, the idea is that marriages are arranged for economic and political purposes. And the Greeks have a very interesting thing with love, because they really thought the highest ideal of love was the love that a man felt for an intelligent younger man who wanted him to be his mentor and who would provide sexual satisfaction for that. Women were to produce children, but younger, intelligent men that you could mentor were to produce sexual and romantic satisfaction. So for whatever reasons and in different ways, for thousands of years, love ceased to be the main reason for marriage. Now, young people often dreamed about marrying for love, and there are great love stories through the ages. But if you look at most love stories through the ages, they end in tragedy. because either someone's already married or they're engaged to someone else. And if they do let them marry, the whole point of the story is that they're separated over and over again. They can't get back together. So these stories, I think, represent a kind of human longing for romance, but they also represent the understanding that marriage was way too an important political and economic institution to jump into it on such a frivolous basis and easily changed basis as, oh, I love that person.
Was polygamy a common practice in pre-modern societies, or to what extent did it
We
exist?
find polygamy is the multiple marriage. Polygyny is polygamy and now I got producing polygamy and polygyny. Polygamy is when a man can marry several women, and you tend to get that very often in early class societies where you don't have a real state and where you don't have a real market, and people gain status by, in a sense, giving away food, but getting service back for that. And so it becomes it is the women who produce the food and the baskets that the big man can trade. So the more women a man can accumulate, the more wealthy he is. And the more wealthy he is, the more other families are eager to ally with him, even if their wife is coming in as a second or third wife. So that's where you get polygamy in that kind of period. It's worth noting that there are societies, we know now of 50 or more societies that had polygyny, where one woman married several men. That tended to be societies where resources were much more scarce, and you needed the men would concentrate and work on the on their properties, and the wife would share with them. So there's all sorts of variations in human history that a lot of people forget about.
Interesting. So I'd like at this point to invite the audience to ask questions, comments. Please feel free to jump in at any time. My next question is, so you argue that marriage originated as a cooperative rather than patriarchal, as some would claim, institution, that there was nothing inherent in marriage, as in slavery, that required one group to subordinate to another. And so when did marriage become an institution where women were treated as second-class citizens?
Well, as I said, I think that has to do with the development of status hierarchy and class hierarchies. Not all of them treated all women as property, but once you there's one thing that women can do that men can't, and that is produce babies. And so once you have inheritance at stake, and you have long-term alliances at stake that you want to make, it becomes very important to a family that has property and power and wants to maintain or increase it, that you have arranged that woman has a baby with a family that you want to be allied with. And so this is where you get, as I said earlier, the institution of illegitimacy, and you get the idea that women have to be trained to obey, that they cannot have sexual freedom, they should not be allowed to choose their own mates. And I think other things that go into it is when you get raiding societies and war societies, where a lot of the wealth gets gathered by the dangerous occupations that men sometimes pursue, that enhances status. So there's a lot of things that contribute to it. I think the property issue is a very important one, but I think it's also true that once raiding or warfare becomes critical, as it is at a certain point in history, to many societies' expansions, then you give men some extra prestige for doing that. And women get excluded from the from the process of production. When you go back to societies where men and women both worked in the fields, or where they both gathered together in the band level societies we're talking about, women often contributed 70% of the food, because the men's labors didn't always bring in a kill, and that had to be shared. So you really relied on the women, and they had total control over their own labor process and how to use it. But when it's men who are bringing in slaves and ratings from someplace else, women are then excluded from the production process, which gives you an
recording in progress.
Sure. Sorry,
Stephanie, yeah, continue. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I should continue. Okay, somebody said question in progress. So, so at any rate, what I was saying is that women get excluded from that, and that's a very interesting lesson we have to remember today. That whenever there are institutions or no institutions that allow women to be equally productive in a society, they tend to be sidelined. This is why we need childcare, and we need support systems for women to be in the workforce.
And just to echo that, in the instances that you were describing, or in those historical periods, domestic labor had a different symbolic value, right? So, for example, in peasant households, where men and women worked at home, right?
Yes, yes, yes. That's very important. Domesticity let's jump up to the European medieval to the pre-modern era, where you had a household family economy. Domesticity at the time meant productive work. And men's, they didn't talk about women being domestic and men being productive. Men and women were considered equally productive. And it's really interesting, and it violates a lot of stereotypes about motherhood and the past. When you look at how England, for example, in early colonial America, organized their households. For them, the most important thing was that this was a household that everybody had to produce in, but it wasn't a self-sufficient household. You had to trade with other people. There were not yet formal banks. So a large part of productive work, it combined economic and interpersonal things. You had to keep good relations with neighbors. You had to produce more than you needed and then trade it. You had to do favors for people, because then they would do favors back. And in that society, men and women did very much the same things. Even if the men did more outside travel, everybody had to be able to do the task of the other person. And so there was a sense that we're all contributors to the household economy. That doesn't mean that women were equal, but they were certainly equally respected as yokemates. And that's one of the interesting paradox you mentioned, that I have this thing about we don't understand patriarchy very well. Patriarchy was arose in aristocratic class societies where men dominated, but class was just as important or more important than gender. In these hierarchical societies, a lower class man doffed his hat, lowered his eyes, and obeyed a mistress. Here's an interesting little fact for you. We think that Mrs., in fact, many feminists got rid of the name Mrs. because, it seemed to, and it did for a while, absorb us into our husband's name. But the origins of Mrs., if you look back in the 17th century, it stood for mistress, which was the exact equivalent of master. It was not all men were called Mr. and not all women were called Mrs. It was only those people who commanded other people. And so a mistress and a master were way above women or men below them. And for women, the ability to run a household, to do that, was more important than the child rearing. And most of those women delegated their child rearing to unmarried servants who earned their money they could get married and establish a farm, or to their own children. So this was a period where women's labor was very much respected, but you had both the Christian tradition and the old Roman and Greek traditions of patriarchy. But I think that let me tell you how I've come to think in my new book about the difference between patriarchy and democracy. If you had added a slogan in patriarchy about women, it would have been, women are very industrious. We cannot do without them. They're our yoke mates, but they're insubordinate. Women are extremely competent. My wife can step in for me as a deputy husband anytime she wants, but women are also conniving. And so we have to keep them down so that they will serve us, not to protect them, but to protect us. Whereas, so patriarchy could be very ruthless, but it didn't have the sort of contempt for women that is tied into the development of democratic capitalism, and that we are still struggling with today. Because that slogan is, women are wonderful, but they're kind of weak. They're so virtuous and communal, but they're kind of vulnerable and perhaps a little too soft to make things go in the, so we can't really elevate them to high status jobs or high aggressive jobs. So it's an interesting paradox, I think.
So maybe we can come back to the question of patriarchy in a second. And if I can go back to what you said previously, when does household labor become a labor of love for women that eventually loses its economic value and becomes symbolically depreciated as well?
Well, this is really a product of the development of democratic capitalism. Two separate things contribute to this. First of all, as I said, in the pre-industrial household economy, both men and women had to combine emotional and practical ways of living. They had to be able to do these tasks, they had to share them, they had to be shrewd bargainers, and women had a reputation as being particularly good at that. And men as well as women had to make nice to social superiors and figure out how to get loans and stay on the good side of people. Well, with the development of the male breadwinner family and the market economy, you get a situation where where work that gets wages moves out of the home. You go to someplace else to work for wages. You don't negotiate and suck up to your boss. You just take orders from your boss. And work that processes the things that you can buy with men's wages moves, stays at home. And so women begin to be seen as the people who guard the home, a newly private space, as a refuge for the men who go out into this newly competitive, calculative world that actually really kind of freaked a lot of men out in the beginnings. They weren't just making things up when they idealized women at home, and the home was refuge. They would say they're not used to having to just winner take all kinds of bargaining. You do something a favor and somebody will do a favor for you. Now it's a whole new world. And they were eager to come home and be protected from that world. Women began to be valued not for the things they did at home, but made at home, but the comforts they provided, both emotional and physical, to their family. So, and that started to be seen not as work, but as love. So men bring home the cash. We're not in a market society where you can buy, your clothes ready-made. A lot of things that become home, even flour has to be sifted by hand, requires a lot of work. But once cash buys some of it and women have to do the rest at home and there's no cash involved for that, that's where you begin to get the idea that men are the productive and women are women do these things out of love. Women are the creators of comfort and love. And
So would it be accurate to say that this happens with the proliferation of wage labor in industrializing societies then?
absolutely, absolutely.
Right. Okay.
And you can see, sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add one sentence, and then you can see that for women, it played a certain role. Patriarchy, women in patriarchy had no doubt of their capabilities. They knew they were good. But on the other hand, they also knew that they just had to obey all the time. So there was a trade-off here. They ceased to be regarded as particularly competent or productive. They become dependents, but they are offered in return idealization because they provide so much love and comfort. And so marriage becomes much softer, even though it's still unequal. And you can see how some women would think this is an okay trade-off.
Right. Thank you for that. I wonder if we have any questions or comments from our listeners, from our audience.
I can't, am I supposed to see the question? Because
they could be in the Q&A box, but looks like we don't have any questions or comments. Please feel free to put a question in the Q&A or raise your hand. So when and why did we develop a totalizing view of a marriage as the special romantic relationship between two soulmates that satisfies most of our needs, if not all of our needs?
Well, that's a long process too. But as I said, young people have always dreamed of being able to marry someone they love. It's just that they were often forbidden to, and sometimes they did, and in fact it didn't work out because the person you love may not be the person you most need to run this household. But as you got the development of wage labor, where you could defy your parents because you could earn, it used to be that you had to wait till, if you were a woman, till the parents gave you a dowry. If you were a man, until they signed over some of the farm to you or let you work in the family business. But with wage labor, a man could go out and earn enough to set up his own household. A woman could go work as a servant and develop her own dowry. So it was much more possible to marry for someone you were attracted to and to have that be the basis. And in addition, there was this greater sense that men and women, had these things to offer each other. And there was also the ideology of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, that the older generation and the state should not dictate to the young. The people have a right to the pursuit of happiness. And so it's about the 18th century that you get people beginning to really glorify the love match. There's a period, if you look at Jane Austen's book, where they have debates, over should you marry for love or should you marry for money? And the happy ending is when you get both. So gradually this idea came that you should marry for love. The older generation was horrified. They thought, the French called it marriage by fascination. And it was considered very dangerous because, after all, if you marry for love, you might get a bad person. If a woman falls in love, she might get seduced by a guy who doesn't intend to marry her, and then she's in real bad trouble. If you fall in love, my goodness, next thing, people are going to be asking for the right to divorce. They were quite right. So there was a lot of concern about the falling for love, but gradually it began to be the accepted way and to work. but it meant a change in love. And soulmate marriage is a very interesting thing, because throughout history, there were such things as soulmate love, usually, but they were romance stories that were never true. Usually it involved a man and a woman falling in love instantly, knowing they were in love, and then almost always ending in tragedy. In the 15th century, there was a humanist ethicist who said, love is a reciprocity of soul. And that is why you should never marry a soulmate, because you need the reciprocity of work. So in the late 18th, early 19th century, you begin to get this idea of a soulmate. But the first idea of a soulmate is really different than what we mean by it today. When you ask people what they mean by a soulmate today, I think they basically mean best mate and good sex, you know. The 19th century idea of soulmate was a reaction to the fact that men and women were increasingly defined as opposites. This was the era of the cult of separate spheres. Men took care of business, they took care of life, they took care of hard decisions and rationality. Women took care of love and emotion, and we just worked in different spheres. So now you're supposed to fall in love, but how do you fall in love with your opposite? Someone whose activities you don't understand, whose emotions you don't understand, who, you know, you don't have the same capabilities. And so the middle class developed, and this, by the way, the black middle class, the free black middle class in America and Canada had the same as the white middle class here. They have this new idea that because men and women were opposites, what attracted them was the similarity of soul, because the soul was where you believed in virtue, you believed in hard work, you believed in religion, and you believed in the separate spheres. So to the extent that you believed in separate spheres in the real world, you were soulmates in your heads and in your emotions. And so there was a period in the 19th century where you get these soulmate marriages. And I've just been studying them for my new book. And you read these letters, and it's just stunning how worried they are, you know, about exploring each other's souls. I've sometimes had my students read these letters. These men are saying, you know, oh, you know, when you're gone, it's like death has taken over me. I must be in contact with your soul. And, you know, the men are sort of going, ooh, when they read the letters, and the women are, occasionally the woman would say, well, why can't you people write letters like that now, you so-called liberated men? But it's because the romance was explicitly non-sexual. It was about this kind of soulmate. So I think that we got, in the 20th century, we moved to a playmate model of marriage. You know, we have good sex, we share activities, we do all this, but we're still supposed to be very different in our outlooks. And I think it's now only recently, in the last 30 or 40 years, that we have been exploring a new notion of soulmate, that men and women needed to share activities, share interests, divide them equally, and go from there. And this, you know, when people ask me what's happening to marriage, I just have to point out, as a historian, no, you know, in millions of years, nobody has ever expected us to organize marriage free from coercion by our biology, free from coercion by the parents or the upper classes, free from being bossed around by the man, free by being totally, you know, having laws about who you can marry and who can't. We're trying to do something that is absolutely unprecedented in history, and that's the reason we're having some trouble with it, I think. We don't want to give up on it, but we got a lot of learning to do. We're in uncharted territory. We're having to write new guidebooks, new rule books.
And speaking about soulmates, and then we do have a couple of questions. I see, thank you. You say that in the 17th and 18th centuries, people did not fall in love, they tiptoed into love. I really appreciated that. Sort of, they reasoned their way into love. And then in the 19th century, there's this term falling, they begin falling in love. And think of it as a kind of self-fulfillment that the previous generation had sought in religious experience, as you put it, right? And love becomes sublime. So there's that change.
Well, love is something, sorry, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think, I'm not sure I heard all of that, but love was something that it was a unwise reason on its own for marriage. So the ideal of love, and you still find this when anthropologists go to traditional countries around the world and ask older couples to define love, and they describe it as mutual respect for the other person's adherence and ability to do their gender roles, mutual consideration. Whereas the young people describe it as, the pursuit of intimacy and leisure and understanding each other. So by tiptoeing into love, it was sort of like, okay, we'll get together, we'll work together. And if we find that we really appreciate each other's work and we play our roles well, and we can have decent enough sex, then we're in love. And that's very different from the previous model, any previous models of love, which tended to be these romantic things that could never happen, and our modern notion of love, which is that we don't really fall in love, but we don't tiptoe either. We probe, we explore, we do things together, find out if we're compatible.
Okay, Christina, you had your hand up. Would you like to ask your question? Okay, well, feel free to raise your hand again, and let's go to questions in the Q&A. What do you have to say about marriage in the future in Scandinavia and Europe? From my experience, marriage doesn't seem to be as important. Do you agree with my observations? And what do you think is in store for marriage in North America in the future?
Well, even in Scandinavia, people tend to marry at some point, but marriage is more, in many of those countries, what you do when you actually kind of completed most of your life. You've had a couple kids, you've been together, you're not going to get divorced. And somehow many people still marry, even though marriage wasn't essential to having the children or to feeling that you're happy, feeling that this is something you had to do just because you were in love. It's sort of the outcome of a tried and true and tested love. So I don't think marriage will go away. But marriage is ceasing, certainly in the Western world, and I think even stronger in the worlds where they haven't caught up with gender equality. Marriage is ceasing to be the be-all and end-all. It's many people feel that that living alone or living apart together or cohabiting is just as good and maybe a little less risky than marriage, because people are always thinking about the possibility of divorce. Is this marriage really going to last? But it's absolutely true that marriage still has quite a reputation, all around the world. When you ask people about marriage, when do you marry? It's the highest expression of commitment they can imagine. But because it's the high, and this is where I think social conservatives get it wrong, and they say people don't value marriage. No, people value marriage a lot. But because it's the highest commitment they can imagine, and because they are no longer willing to put up with inequalities in the marriage and really have high standards for what makes for a marriage, and also understand that marriage takes a lot more negotiation nowadays, when you have two people entering it who want to be equals, people are very reluctant to embark on it unless they're absolutely sure it's going to work. And that's why we're beginning to see such a divergence in marriage rates in most societies, where it's the most educated, the most economically secure, the most comfortable with themselves, the best able to live on their own, who say, okay, let's get married. Because other people, I think, feel that it's a risk or are seen as a risk by potential marriage partners.
And on this note, and more broadly speaking, what trends are we seeing in marriage in the 21st century? And I know your current book that you're working on now is about this. So maybe you can tell us a bit more.
Well,
trends that we're seeing in marriage.
Yes. Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the internal dynamics of marriage are becoming much more egalitarian, much more satisfactory to people. It used to be that if a woman had more education than her husband, that was a risk to the marriage. The man felt threatened, or the woman felt like, oh well, I don't want someone lesser than I. Nowadays, that's not true at all. And in fact, there's some intriguing suggestions that there's a greater threat to marriage when the man has more education than the woman. Not quite proven yet, but some suggestions that were pointing that way. It used to be that when a woman earned more than her husband, this led to divorce. That's also no longer true. One fascinating turnaround is that back in the early 1990s, or maybe late 80s, there was a survey, a mass survey of Americans, and they found that couples where the man and women did less traditional roles and were more equal had worse sex lives and were less happy than couples who did their traditional roles. The man took care of the breadwinning and the woman took care of the home. Well, some people in the Council on Contemporary Family kind of wondered about that, because those were marriages that had been formed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where the pressure to be in traditional roles was very strong, and people who varied from them might do so for not healthy reasons, or might be judged by a partner as being not healthy because they're not normal. So they went back and or interviewed just people who had been married since the 90s, and they found a complete reversal. That the couples who share most equally are the ones who report the happiest marriages, the best sex lives. They're the only couples that are having more sex than the couples back in the 80s and 70s. So these are the kind of changes that are going on. And I know we get impatient. Sometimes men do not step up to the plate as much as we would expect them to. As a historian, I don't think we should let up the pressure at all. But as a historian, I am aware of how long men have been told this is what they do, and women have been told this is what we do. And so just as men sometimes play incompetent in order to, avoid having to confront chores they don't know or understand, women also sometimes do what we call gatekeeping. And that is because we want them to share the chores, but we want to hold on to our expertise at it so they can be our unskilled assistant. Well, that doesn't get you very far. I mean, it's funny. I've been studying this stuff for 25 years, but just a couple of years ago, my husband caught me restocking the dishwasher after he had filled it up. And he said to me, "Why would I ever stock a dishwasher again? if you're just going to redo it because you don't think I did it well. So I said, okay, I promise. No restocking, no matter how. But this sort of dynamic, we have to recognize that we have been socialized into these male and female dynamics, and it takes patience and work and conversation to get over them. But when they do, those are the best. Dan Carlson and a colleague just did a wonderfully interesting study on chore sharing. And we all know that nowadays, the earlier study I showed, couples who share chores are happier. But then they asked another question: do you divide the chores or do you share them? And by divide the chores, it means like, okay, I'll take this 4 and you take that 4. Okay, so maybe it's the total amount. But sharing is like alternating, you know, okay, I do the dishes this week, you do the dishes next week, you do, or whatever, however you work it. What they found is that sharing seems to be the magic solution. The couples who shared chores were much, much happier. And the couples who didn't were sometimes much more unhappy. And I think that the reason probably is that we're all inclined, especially in marriage, when we want to be so equal, is to make sure the other person's playing their weight. But if you haven't done the other chore or not regularly doing it, you don't know what's involved in it. So you can feel like, well, that's an easy one. And you've done yours and you know how hard it is. And you could say he or she doesn't appreciate how hard it is. So the sharing chores. So that's the good news about marriage. We are making real inroads into salt. We haven't solved, but we are making real progress in moving toward equality. The bad news is that the increasing inequality in our society as a whole makes this kind of negotiation and time that it takes to get a really equal marriage going really stressful for people, really hard. It raises the possibility of conflict rather than of a consensus. And more people are simply afraid to invest that much of their lives and their money and their earnings power and their free time in a relationship that might not turn out even, that then and where the other person may be under too much stress or may lose their job or may not step up to the plate. So I think that this inequality and the stress that comes along with the insecure work, gig work, is one of the major threats to marriage.
A parallel with the Great Depression era here that you discuss in your book as well. And chores are transcendental. So we have 2 more questions. Let's look at the Q&A. So most religious narrative reinforced patriarchy as they started in the agrarian age with property. Was the embracing of religions for patriarchy a cause or result of the economic ownership in ownership societies?
That's a really interesting question. That I did an article for a theology magazine on Christ's family values that you might find interesting, and I'll send you it in case you want a link. But I'm not sure of the exact relationship. Certainly, most state religions have bolstered the existing economic structure and political structure, reflected it. They become subsidized by the elites to the extent that they do that. And so certainly some of these religions were ways of sacralizing types of oppression and inequalities that were already in the society. I find Christianity a really interesting one because a lot of the early Christianity was popular because it did not represent a particular class interest or wasn't located in a particular state. And it seemed to speak to everybody. And when you look at Christ's discussion of family values, they actually sound much more like those of our Paleolithic ancestors. His final words when he is on the cross, he looks out and he sees his mother with her relatives. But does he commend her to her family? No, he says to a disciple, here is your mother, and to the mother, here is your son. And this is the fictive family building that we often see in band level egalitarian societies. And at a certain point, when Mary, I'm forgetting all the names. There are so many Marys that I forget all the different names in there, but there's one in which Mary and her sister are hosting a seminar, we would call it today, where Christ is lecturing to them. And one of them is busying around making all the food, and the other wants to sit at his feet as a student, and the one who is making all the food complains. And Jesus says, she has chosen her part, and it is the better part. So there's a lot in Jesus that actually could be read to be much more egalitarian than the Christian church, as it solidified, turned out to be.
And he walks away from family life, right, to do politics or philosophy or both, however you want to describe it. Yeah, which is very different from what you see in St. Augustine,
Yes.
Which is institutionalization of the belief system. Okay, next question. I'm interested in perhaps a minority sentiment. What about people who see marriage as, first of all, commitment? How did these people fare historically? Love may be there, but we know that is probably not going to last, but friendship and commitment will outlast it. I'm married for 35 years, mostly on that basis.
Well, I think that was the ideal marriage, even in feudalism, and a few enlightened parents helped their child find a mate who was economically satisfactory or politically satisfactory, but that they felt that they were friendly enough with that they could learn to love, or even not love, but just have this harmonious relationship. And I think that has been, not everybody can do that. I mean, sex is a strong feeling, and sexual attraction is a strong feeling, and sometimes that can overcome friendship or spoil friendship by distracting people from the friendship. But certainly that's a model that many people over the years have followed, and that may be one of the few models, a minority one, that we would see in almost every society, the few people who can do that.
Okay, and I do have to ask this question, and I know we discussed this on the phone call. So I'd like to ask it for the record. What is your take on the question of glass ceiling and wage discrimination that women, as some argue, face today in Western democracies? Because people such as Jordan Peterson, who has become very popular, argue that this is an outdated feminist claim, because if women are underrepresented, for example, in the hard sciences or positions of power, it is because they have other lifestyle preferences and are not interested in climbing corporate ladders or outcompeting aggressive males. So is there data on that?
There's a lot of data on it. I don't have all of it at my fingertips. I have a whole new chapter on it in my book, but let me just make it just a short answer. This is the same, this is being said all over the place. But it started with the paradox that in societies that are highly unequal, more women choose to enter science and science and math skills and occupations than in America. And so some people say, well, that's because that's the only way they can support themselves, and we get supported in more democratic societies. We can get supported and we can choose what we want. But this idea that people choose what they want, I mean, it is true that women in more economically advanced democratic societies tend to express more of a preference for more feminine educational pursuits and an aversion to fields such as math. But that's not inherent in women's nature. And in fact, there's an interesting international data that finds that internalized norms like girls don't like math are absent in countries where inequality is openly enforced, and parents of schools tell girls they are or are not allowed to do things. What happens with democracy, what happened with democracy, is that we built up a whole new rationale, in some ways much softer. This goes back to our discussion of patriarchy versus domesticity at the very beginning. Democracy came up with this idea that nobody should have to kowtow to anybody. We're all created equal. And as soon as it did that, Blacks and women started saying, well, and then how come it's all white males doing things? And there was a heroic minority of people who stood up and said, well, no, then let's extend it to women and to men. But the easiest way out, I think emotionally, not necessarily conspiratorially, was to say, well, you know, we have to have this kind of division of labor, and we're going to explain it by saying that women are just natural. We don't ask women to do these things. They're just naturally this way. But that totally discounts socialization. Let me just give you a few examples of the kind of socialization that make women choose these things. And that's even, you know, please remind me if we have time to talk about what happens when they do choose it and how they get shoved out. They don't drop out purposely. But at any rate, you get these ideas that women, girls and boys, from the time they're 2, we've made studies of parents walking with their babies. Girls are forced to hold the hands of the parents. Boys are allowed to walk without holding hands. Right there at age 1 or 2, when they're first being taught to explore the world, they're being told, you don't want to explore the world. You want the safety of the hand. You need the safety of the hand. By 2 or 3, girls and boys generally are beginning to learn what tools and what clothes women and males and females do. The more they learn about it, the more they choose those. The ones who don't know will choose randomly, but the ones who have learned will say, okay, I want the broom or I want the hammer. But you don't get any of these stereotypes in terms of smart, aggressive, assertive, until around age 7. And then they do these fascinating studies. And let me just look at one, because I got it out when you asked me about this earlier. Back in 2017, they followed 400 children aged 5 to 7 from a community in Illinois. And at 5, and then again at 7, they gave the kids, they told the story about one kid, they didn't specify the gender, who was really, really smart, and one who was really, really nice. And when they're asked to, there's 2 people of each, and 4 people. And so 2 are really smart and 2 are really nice. So they ask the kids then afterwards to pictures. They show them a picture of 2 girls and 2 boys, and they say, well, which is the smart one? Which is which are the nicer ones? Which are the smart ones? Well, typically kids that age, when asked to draw or describe something, will pick their own gender. And sure enough, at 5, the girls picked the smart one. Like if they asked here, which of them was the smart one? They'd pick the smart one as, they picked the girl as a smart one. And by age 6, however, when they were asked which one is smart and which one is nice, the girls were picking the boy as smart and the girl as nice. Now, that's exactly the age that they have started seeing in practice all the stereotypes about girls and boys. They did another fascinating thing. They got a game where they had one. They told them that one was for kids that were really smart, and one was for kids who try hard. And so they asked now when the 5-year-olds were asked this, there were no gender differences in which game they wanted to play. But when the 7-year-olds were asked it, the game that was described as for really smart kids, the girls just left it alone. The game that was same game, but when described as for try hard, then the girls would go for that. So I think that we see that these stereotypes start really, really early. And then they are reinforced in so many ways. I mean, when you look at the what they call the leaky pipeline, you know, when a girl does sign up for math or science, they're dropping out all along the way, not because they can't do it, but because of the treatment that they get there. And there's masses of studies on that. I can't, you know, go to my source and I would bore the crap out of you if I did and show you the 35 studies I've got that I list in my book, but they're there. And so this is, so these things, there's just, it's what's overdetermined. You start being socialized. Oh, here's another interesting fact. When parents start to Google a question and it starts, is my 2-year-old, the most likely word is gifted. Is my 2-year-old gifted? They're 2.5 times more likely to ask that of a boy rather than a girl, even though girls put sentences together earlier and use more complex sentences, that they are much more likely to assume their boy is gifted. So you've got that, you've got the toys, you've got them getting to the 7 years old when they're seeing who does what in the world. And then on top of that, you get the teasing that goes on in middle school. If you're, you know, if you're too smart, if you're a girl, whereas if you're a boy, you get teased if you're too nice. And then you get into the situation where you've already been channeled against choosing really hard fields. But when you do, there is the promotion leakage. Women are not promoted at the same, and especially in the ones that are considerably male aggressive oriented, they get picked on so much that they tend to drop out along the pipeline. And if you want one more overdetermined factor, then if you want to have kids, a man doesn't have to choose between having a kid and being in an aggressive job. If he tries to take time off, though, he's punished. So he's got to really devote himself to that. A woman has to choose because she is immediately, she's not allowed to take time off in the really aggressive jobs. It's only the other ones that tend to allow it. So, I mean, when you put those together, you know, this is crap. The idea that it's born into their genes. Sorry, but that is my reaction.
And so how would you answer the question about wage discrimination?
What?
How would you answer the question about wage discrimination?
Race discrimination?
Wages.
Wage discrimination. Yes. Well, when wage discrimination comes as a result of a bunch of things, a lot of it has to do with that employers' expectations of what a woman is going to do when if she gets married and has a baby. At this point, women with the same educational degrees and the same job classification earn on average 96% of what men do. But they start falling behind even before they've had children because of differential promotion policies. And the criteria for promotion are often male biased. You know, they have to do with, well, how aggressive are you? How fast do you do this? Not what your final results are. I think most of you probably know what happens when they started doing blind auditions for musicians. And suddenly women who had only been like 2 or 3% of the people considered good enough to be in orchestras were now 50%. So there's so many factors that factor into this. You know, let's give everybody equal chances. Let's level up the playing field. Let's raise boys that it's okay to be nice and girls that it's okay to be smart. And then we'll see if there's anything left. But it's people who claim that there is, let's challenge them to test it.
Awesome, Stephanie. Thank you so very much for joining us. today and sharing your research. This has been a great conversation. I'm looking forward to your new book. Maybe we can have you back to
Sure,
discuss that.
Sure.
Thank you all for attending the webinar. Please take a moment to fill out the survey that you will receive in your emails via Zoom, and stay tuned for announcements about our next events, including webinars and coffee chats. And once again, thank you so very much, Stefan. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.